Hi, Andre Bester here, and you're joining me on This Is What We Were Told. Today I'd like to talk about what I think is the real amazing wonder of life. How life, in its astounding abundance and diversity, is meticulously regulated when it comes to conception, birth, growth, maturity, and death. In my own mind, this story points to something much grander and more awe-inspiring than a story about some deity who spoke, "Let there be," and things popped into existence. I mean, in a God story, what do you expect to happen when the deity says, "Let there be"? Of course, you'd expect that whatever was called for will be. It is so predictable and totally unimaginative. But there is a deeper level of understanding and inspiration waiting for those who truly desire to know who we are and what our place in this majestic picture is. All the evidence we have at our disposal today supports the idea that the development of life on Earth was an arduous process, repeatedly and abruptly interrupted by cataclysmic events. Time and again, this caused mass extinction of established life. And in the wake of each of these destructive events, new forms of life emerged. This pattern has been so destructive that by the time humankind showed up on Earth, the vast majority of all life that ever called Earth home had already gone extinct. Let that sink in a bit. It turns out life is a very fragile thing indeed. The life forms cohabiting the Earth with us today are mostly relatively young and recent branches of life in the bigger picture of the history of the Earth. The evidence at our disposal shows that life gradually developed and diversified into more complex and differentiated species. Above all, the evidence supports the idea that this diversification was driven by external factors that were prevalent at various junctures during the Earth's history. These factors favored certain biological traits above others, leading to the advancement of those traits. This phenomenon is the very foundation of the doctrine of evolution by natural selection. As a life form reproduces, the DNA code carried in each of its cells is replicated, and one replica is passed on to its successor at conception. As we know, this DNA code determines how the successor will look, interact with its environment, and eventually die. But during the process of DNA replication, small deviations in the DNA code can occasionally slip in. This means that the newly created offspring will carry a DNA code in its cells that slightly deviates from the DNA code in its parent cells. These deviations lead to small, sometimes even imperceptible differences between predecessor and successor. This replication process is almost like copying the pattern of a basic shape onto a thin sheet of paper by hand. Let's say, for argument's sake, that you have a picture of a triangle. Trace the shape of that triangle by hand on a new clean sheet of thin paper. If you now take that copy and trace it by hand on another clean sheet of thin paper, you probably will end up with a copy that is pretty much identical to the triangle you started off with. But if you take that copy and you trace it by hand on yet another clean sheet of thin paper, you might start seeing small differences between the original triangle and your last copy. Continue doing this process. Just keep on tracing your most recent copy on a new clean sheet of thin paper. There's only one rule. You may not refer to the original triangle or to any of your earlier copies. You may only use your most recent copy as your template. Now repeat this pattern 1,000,000 times. Then compare your 1,000,000th copy with the triangle you originally started off with. If you're honest, you'll admit that your 1,000,000th copy looks nothing like the triangle you started off with. This is more or less the same thing that happens during the replication of a DNA code. Only with DNA, the occurrence of a deviation is more rare, and the process of change stretches over thousands of years. Often these changes are of no real consequence, but occasionally prevailing external factors like temperature, the availability of food or water, or the ability to blend in with one's surroundings could potentially favor one biological trait over another. A practical example. A particular species of finch has for thousands of years been feeding on a particular diet of seeds. And then, during a prolonged period of drought in the region, the plants producing these seeds start dying off. This has an immediate impact on the finches. At first, they start competing fiercely amongst themselves over the reduced food supply. The more docile and submissive ones amongst them quickly perish because they don't have what it takes to compete. Obviously, this also quickly removes their biological traits from the gene pool because they are no longer there to produce offspring. But there are other plants that are more drought resistant that also produce seeds. These seeds would have been a great alternative for the finches, if only the finches' delicate bills were a little sturdier to break the hard outer shells. But then, one day, due to a deviation during the replication of DNA, a finch chick hatches that has a slightly sturdier bill than the others, and this chick survives into adulthood. This chick's bill is strong enough to break the seeds of the drought-resistant plants. This bird has a significant advantage over its peers in terms of range of food sources. So now the question is this: which biological trait stands the best chance of surviving and reproducing? The smaller bill or the sturdier bill? The sturdier bill, of course. This is the trait that allows access to more food under changed circumstances. The others are simply going to die with the progression of time. Within one generation, an evolutionary change happened that now proves extremely beneficial under the prevailing conditions. If there wasn't a prolonged drought, the sturdier bill would probably have amounted to nothing more than an exception. But under the prolonged drought conditions, it has suddenly become the biological trait that is guaranteed to be carried over into future generations of these finches. The prevailing natural conditions in this specific region have selected in favor of finches with sturdier bills. This region will see finches with more delicate bills gradually dying out, and finches with sturdier bills increasing in number. One small step towards the rise of a new species. It's not a new species yet, but it's one small step in that direction. In exactly the same way that small changes in life forms occur, small changes in the Earth's morphology happen, mostly imperceptibly over the short term, but astonishingly significant over millions of years. The oceans and dry land we know today have not been formed on one single occasion as the Bible wants us to believe. Over millions of years, the forces of plate tectonics, continental drift, volcanic activity, climate change, and radiation have been shaping and reshaping our world. During the megathrust oceanic quake in Indonesia that occurred in December 2004, there were areas where the land elevation of the coastline changed by more than a meter in a couple of seconds. If this kind of event repeats only every 10,000 years, can you imagine how different a coastline will look after 1 million years? These small changes drive natural selection and, given enough time, produce the most amazing and surprising results. Supporters of the Genesis creation narrative make a big deal of what they regard to be the fatal weakness in the doctrine of evolution by natural selection: the glaring absence of so-called missing links. The argument goes like this: if it is true that species evolved over millions of years, from generation to generation slowly changing in appearance and behavior, then surely the fossil history must be able to produce specimens of each phase of development of a species. This argument says the fossil evidence must show the stepwise evolution of a species before it can be stated for a fact that species indeed evolve over time. Closer to the origins of humankind, creationists argue that the fossil history must show the different phases of development of apes into humans before it can be said that humans evolved from apes. If there are gaps or missing links in the chain of development, we cannot state with conviction that species evolve over time and that humans evolved from apes. Of course, we are painfully aware thereof that the available fossil record is fragmented, and this inevitably frustrates attempts to show a solid chain of development. Considering the expanse of time during which life on Earth has been in existence, the available fossil record is indeed quite sparse. But there are many reasons for this. Soft tissue rarely becomes fossilized because decomposition usually sets in long before there is any chance for fossilization. Harder substances like bone, teeth, and keratin stand a better chance of becoming fossilized. Predation causes substantial degradation of a body and can leave a carcass with substantial parts missing. In nature, available food sources are typically fully exploited, and there's often little left of a dead animal or plant that could potentially become fossilized. The phenomenon of fossilization is very rare in nature and requires specific conditions in order to occur. On the rare occasion where fossilization does happen, the fossilized remains are entirely at the mercy of nature for their preservation. They are subject to brutally destructive forces like continental drift, plate tectonics, earthquakes, rockfalls, landslides, avalanches, acidity, flooding, and human activity. Let's be frank, a fossil that lies exposed to the whims of nature for 1 million years or more is basically guaranteed to face most of these destructive forces at some point in time. And then, even if a fossil does make it into the 21st century unscathed, it is of no value as long as it lies undiscovered. Of course, we have some idea where to look, but it's not so easy when you're not certain what you're looking for or what you're looking at. All we know is that the Earth is yet to reveal some amazing secrets from ages gone by. With the odds stacked so heavily against fossilization, the specimens we have already uncovered are true rarities. In fact, to hold a specimen in one's hand, knowing that this rock is evidence to a life that was lived when the Earth was much younger and that it has survived the passing of eternity to come and tell us its story is truly a humbling experience. And even though the volume of fossil evidence is finite, this body of evidence generously reveals a chain of development over billions of years, from simple single-celled organisms to life in all its staggering complexity and diversity. And this chain of development and diversification is not as straightforward as species A becoming species B. Of course, it seems many creationists, in their naivety, assume that this is what evolution by natural selection suggests. But just by looking at our own ancestry, we can see that it is not as simple as saying that species A gave rise to species B. There was a time during the last 200,000 years when 4 different species of the genus Homo co-inhabited the earth at the same time. For a short while, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo floresiensis, Homo denisova, and Homo sapiens all occupied Earth at the same time. For all practical purposes, they could all be termed human because they all closely resembled Homo sapiens, and they all lived a hunter-gatherer lifestyle in organized social structures, just like us. But on a more granular level, each of them was a genetically distinct species. We were the only species that survived. So which one of these species gave rise to us? Who knows? Possibly none of them. No, natural selection is a much more intelligent, sophisticated, and ingenious process than simply species A becoming species B. There are far too many variables at play in the process of natural selection to define it in terms of such an immature and myopic summary. This is what makes natural selection so amazing and glorious. Sometimes a particular genetic variation helps an organism to survive and maybe thrive under certain conditions, whereas under different conditions, that very same variation is either of no consequence or it can even doom the organism to failure. As for the so-called missing links in our fossil history, they no longer are of any relevance. Since the discovery of DNA and the way in which this modest chain of molecules defines life, the fossil evidence no longer has any need to offer a response to accusations of missing links. The Human Genome Project that concluded in 2003 conclusively proved that over billions of years and millions of generations, genetic mutations in the replication of DNA have led to diversification of species. It has proven conclusively that all life, plants, animals, and humans, share a common ancestor. The fossil evidence now has little more of a role to play than to delightfully demonstrate in practical terms what we already know from DNA. Considering what we know today with perfect clarity regarding the world in which we live, the evidence is pretty compelling that religious belief has been tripping us up where it comes to our understanding of our own place in the grand scheme of life. I'll explain in a moment. I think one of our biggest blind spots, for which religious belief has to take part of the blame, is our lack of a proper appreciation for the passing of time. This has set us up to develop a hugely overinflated sense of self-importance and supremacy. Let's just get a bit of perspective. Humankind, Homo sapiens, has only been around for the last 200,000 years, give or take. By the time of our arrival here, The vast majority of life forms that ever called Earth home have already become extinct. The Earth itself is approximately 4.6 billion years old. If we were to compress this 4.6 billion year lifespan into one calendar year, and we say 1 January represents the day on which the Earth became habitable, and 31 December represents today, take a guess where humankind's arrival will reflect on this calendar. The last half hour of the night of 31 December. Humankind's entire existence on Earth is a drop in an ocean of time. Our entire existence here is nothing more than a single snapshot in an album of memories spanning billions of years. And our little snapshot is preceded by millions of snapshots, of which many have become pretty vague. And now religion proclaims to know with clarity and certainty where everything comes from. The Abrahamic faiths, which includes Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, have been around for barely the last 3,000 years or so. A measly 1% of the time humankind has been in existence. For the first 197,000 years of humankind's existence, there was no God, or Yahweh, or Allah. There was no Bible, or Torah, or Quran. These are all products of the last 1% of the entire period of existence of humankind. Do you think these faiths will tell us that all humankind preceding the rise of the Abrahamic faiths are doomed because they lived in times when these gods have not even yet been conceived? Sorry, my common sense is telling me that the evidence is pointing to a vastly bigger picture than what religion is trying to sell us. This picture only starts coming into view when we stop pressing our noses against one spot of the canvas and stand back to consider the picture in its entire context. And the discovery of this bigger picture, the vastness, depth, and complexity thereof, and the vulnerability of balance within this picture, cannot leave a person unchanged. Friends, on this channel I talk about issues of faith and religion that seriously challenged my belief in the integrity of the Bible. In 2020, I published a book on my spiritual journey called This Is What We Were Told. My book is aimed at challenging people to dare to look beyond the limitations of religious belief and to take in the bigger picture of the wonder of life. I provide some food for thought for others who might be finding themselves in a spiritual dead end and who are searching for a more meaningful understanding of the world in which we live. On this channel, I'm giving viewers a taste of the topics I cover in my book. On this channel and through my book, I aim to awaken people to the wonders of life playing out right around us, just beyond the boundaries of faith. If you're interested in a copy of my book, mail me at the address on the screen and I'll be in touch. Have a lovely day.